Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Olsen. I am so excited to be here and very appreciative of Chris for giving me the opportunity to present with so many amazing people. So let's just get started. Let me bring up my screen share. Okay. So I saw this picture this morning. It's an advertisement. My son was at tennis practice, and I'm like, this is absolutely perfect to lead in. So, I mean, there's so many things wrong with this picture, but I just saw it at a quarter of my eye, and I'm like, effortless perfection. It's exactly what I'm not going to be talking about today. And there's actually some psychological principles behind this concept of effortless perfection, and I'll get to those later in my talk, but I just thought that this was like the coolest thing to start with because it is so wrong on so many levels, but it is also how so many people do think about thinking and how students learn. And what I want to talk today is about how to create a little more student-centric classrooms. And I have three key ways that we can get there very quickly. So that's why I'm talking about encouraging voice, questions, and engagement, and have students become co-authors of our teaching. And obviously I'm talking today about a huge paradigm shift in the classroom from the standard classroom transaction model where the teacher is going to be in front of the room giving all the information that the students need to a far more engaging and collaborative classroom environment. So I'll probably tell you more about my story as we go here, but let's just dig in. All right, so here's a question for Twitter. I love these sorts of things. What's one small thing you've done in the classroom that has improved student learning? So we're session 8. So I have one already queued up that I'm going to tweet out right now. And that went out. And what I tweeted out was, I heard in a workshop one time that if you, in group work, use odd digits when you time groups. So instead of doing, okay, we're going to do stations and everybody has 5 minutes, use odd combinations. So you can do 452 or 601, and that actually clues in learners and creates a little bit more of a cognitive awareness to their surroundings, especially struggling learners. ESL students, those times really respond to that, and I've just gotten in the habit of doing it whenever I present and just thinking of crazy number combinations, and it works. It's the coolest thing. So if people are out there and have a great tip that they want to share, hashtag the EdCollab gathering, session number 8, so hashtag 8, and put it out, and we'll hopefully be able to share some of those as we go through our session. I just love those small types of things. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk a little bit about revolutionizing your teaching with 3 different student-centric ideas. The first is employing generative learning. The second is shifting the classroom paradigm, that traditional classroom transaction model, by encouraging questions and working alongside students. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about surveying your students and why that's important. The cool thing is all 3 of these concepts are all free. And that is just so cool. All free. Seriously? They're free? Yes, they are all free. So let's get started and talk about generative learning. Generative learning is a fancy name for trial and error. And I'll talk a little bit about the psychology behind this. But generative learning is really at the root of all of those cool ideas that I'm going to talk about and show some really amazing examples of. All of the PBLs and the soul lessons and all the Genius Hour, that's all generative learning. Students are asked to solve a problem without the benefits of being taught how. And I think any of us with young children realize how those young children learn. And I know elementary teachers get this, but I think as we progress through upper levels of school, students are a little bit more spoon-fed. So letting them tackle these questions and learning from their errors. Merlin Wittrock, I have a quote here from Merlin Wittrock, who's kind of one of the founders of the generative learning movement. He's out of UCLA, and he says, the generative model is a model of teaching of comprehension and the learning of the types of relations that learners must construct between stored knowledge, memories of experience, and new information for comprehension to occur. So the thing is, when we think about learning, I'm going to toggle back here. When we think about learning, and that's why that first slide was so egregiously wrong, because they say learning is supposed to be easy, but we know learning is not easy. And a common criticism of school is that it's not rigorous enough. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but one of the ways to make it more rigorous is to let students learn from their mistakes and to explore the errors that they make. How do we do this? Let's go back here. We do this in a number of ways. First off, we have to encourage failure, let kids make mistakes. Work through things, and psychologists understand how this influences learners. It makes them better in terms of memory retention and in terms of something that they call working memory, which is your ability to think on the fly. There was a great study, a very famous study that was done in Paris a few years ago, where they gave students these really complex anagrams, and they asked them to solve these anagrams. And one group of students couldn't do it. All groups of students couldn't do it. One was reinforced by the message was reinforced that it was okay that they didn't know how to do it. The other one wasn't told anything like that. On later tests, the groups that were told it was okay to make these mistakes, you didn't understand it, their working memory was better when they took other tests, because they were able to compartmentalize and think on the fly, and they realized that, hey, I can work through things. And that has kind of influenced a whole bunch of different movements like FailCon, the Festival of Errors, a bunch of other things that people have kind of put together to celebrate failure. And there's the great line from Edison when he talks about the light bulb: "I've not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work." So he argued that perseverance in the face of failure is the key to success. And I think we all know that. So we're talking about generative learning. A lot of these ideas are out of a new book that I have here called Make It Stick. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It's subtitled The Science of Successful Learning. So what can we do? Learning by doing. What's interesting, and I'm going to toggle back. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a famous psychologist. His name was B.F. Skinner. And Skinner said that learning should be errorless. He actually coined this term called errorless learning, that students shouldn't make mistakes, because if they make mistakes, they are going to learn bad habits. And I think a lot of us coaches know that, but we do so much trial and error in sports that we're not afraid if students or if our young athletes make errors, because we know we're going to give them corrective feedback and work with them. So B.F. Skinner publishes this book. It's called Science and Human Behavior, and it was really huge, very popular, and it kind of shaped, especially a lot of us. I'm 37, so a lot of us that are maybe my age or older were taught by people that kind of maybe grew up in this movement. And I can remember when I was in school, we didn't do so much trial and error. We did trial and error in woodshop, and that's probably why I loved woodshop, but and still do today. Love tinkering with things, but in a lot of subjects we were told exactly how to do it, and we were mistakes were kind of moved away. So the teacher would teach us and show us how to do things. Like if we're talking about writing thesis statements, I was taught how to write a thesis statement. I didn't necessarily explore thesis statements on my end, and I certainly didn't ever do a thesis statement first without being taught how to learn from those mistakes. So that's kind of like the Skinner model, and it dominated. There's probably a dissertation in here for somebody in terms of how Skinner influenced how we teach our children about failure and learning. So let me go back to my slideshow. So that's a big plug for learning by doing and having students explore things. Something else you can do on Monday in your class is give students formative assessment before they've even encountered the material. Research shows that students will benefit from this and remember the material more and for greater periods of time if formative assessment is used prior to instruction. I think math teachers probably do this well when they are, give students a problem, but a lot of times the problems are things that they've already learned. So giving them stuff before they've even seen it, if we're talking about a poem, having them analyze the poem before we've even talked about the specific lens that we're looking at it through or any of those things, having students tackle that and not being afraid if they're going to get it wrong. Have students make predictions if we're going to talk about some sort of empire in history class without even tackling it. And this is so different than what a lot of people think, and certainly I was guilty of this many times when I taught, being afraid to have students make predictions about what they think is going to happen. Because the cool thing is maybe some of them know what to expect, and then you can kind of change your teaching to meet those learners that already think they know what's going on. Working problems prior to class, the University of Washington's physics department, they require students to work problems before they've even gone into class, and students don't necessarily like it. But the point here is with the picture of effortless perfection, perfection is nobody's ever perfect without any effort, and if we're not having our students exert effort in the classroom, I think we might be shortchanging them just a little bit. The simple task, this is a cool one that I got from the book. If you're using some sort of note system or a review, students actually will remember a little better. Even if the font is different, actually will work too, studies show. If the font is a little fuzzy, they'll remember that because they have to kind of work through it, but filling out missing words or even letters will help students retain information better. And this is the best, right to learn. I'm going to share a case study with you about right to learn in a second, but this is asking students to summarize what they have learned after they've learned it, but also how it's generative, applying that knowledge in a new context. And a lot of people, I'll talk a little bit later about transfer goals, transfer skills, something that's kind of been incorporated into the Understanding by Design model and Grant Wiggins. But right to learn is generative because it's asking students to make predictions about something else and connections between their recently acquired knowledge and new information. So here's a cool case study. This was in an introductory psychology class, and over 800 students did two things. Sometimes they copied from slides that summarized main ideas, like the traditional note-taking model. But sometimes, after learning material, they used a generative approach and generated their own writing summaries of the key ideas. For example, they restated concepts in their own words and elaborated on the concepts by generating examples of them. So we've got two things here. You have students that summarized or just took notes from screens, or students that created their own authentic written summaries of the material in their own words and elaborated on the concepts. So who do you think did better? Let's think about this one. Well, of course, the students that wrote to learn scored significantly better than those who had just copied. So it's so cool. And right to learn is something so simple. Instead of, not to say that a multiple choice exit ticket doesn't work. Those certainly can work, especially if the questions are a little bit generative. But the right to learn studies are showing now that that's the way to go if you want students to retain information and also struggle a little bit in the learning process. So here's Make It Stick. We're actually making this. I'm not a book pusher, but if you're looking for a cool book to read, this book has really changed a lot. It just came out in the spring of this year, and our whole high school is going to read it. And think about picking it up maybe. So what we have here is really a tale of two classrooms. We've got a traditional classroom, which you can see over there with the desks. This is my school, and these desks are moved, but this is the model that's been employed for 120 years in education, the columns and rows. And to the right we have these awesome rolly chairs. They're called node chairs, and they are fabulous. But what this kind of symbolizes, these two pictures, is what's the approach that we're taking? Are we going to let students get a little messy? Are we going to get out of columns and rows? Or are we going to retain the column and row model? So I'm going to share some things that I've done in the classroom. the best way to recreate your classroom environment and become more student-centric is to engage the students. And it's not to say that a direct instruction lecture is not engaging. I've certainly seen some direct instruction that is mind-blowingly good. But I think over time, maybe students might get bored of those types of classes. So let's talk a little bit about engagement. I've got a lot of buzzwords all around the screen here, so if you can take a look. All sorts of different ideas. I'll take them a little bit at a time. You're probably familiar with Genius Hour. Genius Hour and Google's 20% time are very similar. This is the idea that we need to carve out time for students to explore something that they're passionate about. I'm going to show you some cool examples. I did Google 20% time for much of my teaching career. I loved it. We carved out time every Friday for students to work on something. The only precondition was that it was interdisciplinary, that it had to bring in other subjects like English and biology and computer science and those types of subjects. And they can do anything they want. And I'll show you some neat examples. Genius Hour is very similar. You know the problem in project-based learnings. You've heard about those models. A few that you might not have heard about are soul lessons, which is Sugatra Mitra's. He won a TED Prize for this idea, and I'm going to show you a cool example of soul lessons in a few minutes. FedEx days are kind of like soul lessons, a little bit bigger, but they're named FedEx days because you have to deliver a product in 24 hours, kind of like what FedEx does. So there's a little bit of a deadline for people. And Laddie is something that we've employed in a lot of our elementary schools. It's very cool. I didn't know about it before I came to my current school district, which is in Randolph Township. And Laddie stands for Learner Active Technology Infused Classrooms. And it's more of a very differentiated model where students walk into a classroom and are presented with a packet of information, and they have a lot of choice embedded in that model. Laddie isn't too well known. It's really, I think, New Jersey, maybe a little New York and Florida, kind of like an East Coast phenomenon somewhat, but very cool when used well, and it's very much built on student choice and letting them choose the types of projects that they want to do. So I have a video here that I want to share, and this is a former amazing student that I had who, as part of our Google's 20% time, wanted to explore hovercrafts and the history of hovercrafts, and she built her own hovercraft. So take a look at this. I think that's the coolest thing. These students do things and they just blow you away. And no lesson I could have ever prepared would have been as cool as this. This student, her name was Vivian, used a leaf blower and a plywood base with a plastic bag, which kind of created some kind of like some suction, so the leaf blower would actually push her seat and the plywood off the ground. She hooked up the leaf blower. Well, leaf blower was gas powered, but she hooked up this fan so it would kind of propel her forward. She's got a cardboard rudder there, and she's able to move right along the street here. She's got a little cardboard rudder so she can direct herself a little bit, and she just wanted to explore hovercrafts. And the point is, we gave her the time to do that in the classroom, and I don't know if she'll go on and build hovercrafts in the future, but I think the lesson that she came out of here and other students are about, the lessons about the possibility that we can give them if we give them a little bit of liberty in the classroom. What are they capable of building? Now, the other component of all this is, what about the curriculum, right? How, if we're doing this, how do we get the curriculum that we need to do? So there you can start to employ you can employ more, sorry, as tweets come in, I kind of get thrown off, but that's awesome. So if you have a tweet, feel free. I love seeing them. And the students are just encouraged to explore their own imaginations. So the flipped learning model can deliver content. You can, you have to make educated decisions. What's essential that these students know? Am I spending too much time on this particular standard? Can they do a little bit more of this on their own time so we can free up class time? And those are decisions that you're going to have to make when you're teaching. And some things, you're not going to be able to make time for, that you have to cover stuff. But there's other ways to maybe possibly cover it. This is something else I want to share that came out of our 20% time. A group of students loved the Rube Goldberg concept. And Rube Goldberg was a cartoonist in, I think, the 1950s or so. He actually won a Pulitzer Prize, and he made all these cool cartoons about crazy contraptions. And they wanted to create their own Rube Goldberg. So there's like a historical component. This is a very famous cartoonist. He's actually a person who lived. I always thought it was just a term. I had no idea until my students did this. And this is probably, in the annals of like craziest things that you ever encounter when you're teaching. This is what these guys did. It's so cool. So check this out. So that's literally the coolest thing ever, right? I mean, like, how could I have ever even imagined that a group of like 5 students are going to clear out all the furniture out of their, their basement or their first floor and create that entire mechanism just to water a plant? But you see, they did computer programming, they did robotics, they did just simple scientific concepts to make that happen, and it was rooted in other principles that they learned in history class. And trust me, they failed many times putting that together. And when they finally got it to go, they were like, it was the greatest thing ever. And those kids, I know, are going to be so successful. Just the ability to think outside the box like that. But giving them, the point is, you have to give them the ability to do that and to let them know it's okay. We had plenty of projects that we did with Google 20% time that didn't work out. Some weren't that great. Others would blow your mind, like students that decided to create their own 3D scanner for like $50 and stuff like that. And just really cool stuff. But the struggle as educators is finding the balance. What do you take? What do you keep in? What do you take out? What are you putting a premium on? What do you want? And I think when you start your school year, you have to think about, what do I want my kids to come out of my class knowing? Do I want them to know all the nuances of the Egyptian empire? That's fine. I mean, that has value, certainly. Or do I want them to become better thinkers, better collaborators, more independent thinkers, critical thinking, better writers? Do I want them to know what's going on in the world, be able to analyze all of these things? And that's a decision you have to make, and you have to find ways to balance it and work with your colleagues to get there. So let's see what else we have on tap. We just did a couple of our amazing teachers, I'll just say their names, Roberta Spray and Liz Meehan and Kristen Germanario, did a fabulous soul lesson first week of school. They gave students this self-organized learning environment. Students walk in a soul lesson, and they're presented with a problem statement. You can see the problem statement right up here. What are the causes and effects of epidemics from a global perspective? And I'll walk you through kind of the stages of the soul lesson. This is something you could put together this week if you're thinking of a topic We'll look at what the essential question is. Maybe that's your sole question. If your curriculum is in the UBD model, or look at a skill statement and try starting putting a question mark behind it and see what happens there. Soul lessons are easy to do, and it's really 3 stages. They're supposedly designed for a class period, kind of like a traditional block, and about under 60 minutes. So you start with the question, a brief introduction. You're certainly able to say what your expectations are and provide some sort of a hook. It could be a nonfiction article, could be a little video clip, and they, with the the topic that the teachers did yesterday, or last week, was the epidemics. So they showed something about the Ebola outbreak, and this was a interdisciplinary history and biology lesson. And then it's investigation. The cool thing about Soul is students make up their own groups, and that's scary for a lot of teachers. It was scary for me. We allowed students, when we did Google 20% time, to make up their own groups, and sometimes the groups are too big, so you might want to step in there. But if you put a limitation, you're certainly able in a Soul lesson to say no more than 5. And try and discourage independent working for something like this, because it's just a class project. But if it's a long-term project and a kid wants to work on their own, maybe it can work. The hovercraft certainly worked from my perspective. So it's not a hard and fast rule about that. But in Soul, they do pick their own groups, and they can change groups during the class period. So if they're not, kind of like, voting with their feet, they get to move on, and they can switch if they see a topic that they might like a little bit better. And then you review at the end. So you can see right here, 60 minutes. I have some examples. So if you're thinking about, in English, what is irony? There's a question that could set up a Soul lesson for you. If you're another sciences, can anything be math? Can anything be less than 0? Let students tackle this. And another, how could a poem change history? And that's it. You don't give much more guidance than that for students as they begin to explore. And what this is talking about here is all child-driven learning, and you can see what these are going to hit as you go through this lesson. Students create some autonomy for themselves here. They're creating their own groups. They're deciding what component of the problem they're going to look at. In that example that we have from Randolph, what is the disease they're going to focus on? So they can pick anything. At the root of all of these things is really the concept about transfer. How do we take information that we just learned and apply it in some sort of new context? And I think Grant Wiggins is a great line. The students show mastery when they're able to do something without being told. And I love that line, and it kind of guides how I think about education. I want students to create something that's never been created before, so I need to give them class time. I need to give them liberties to pursue what they're interested in. And what I'm going to show you here is a project that I did with students. It was kind of a twist on the 6-word memoir. I wanted students to, first of all, explore 6-word memoirs in English class, but in history class, I wanted them to take the 6-word memoir and apply it to the philosophers who were studying the Enlightenment. So if you were studying Diderot, what would Diderot's 6-word memoir be? How would he summarize his life in 6 words? So you can see what the idea of transfer is here. We also took it a step further because we were looking at computer programming, HTML, and CSS, and Mozilla has a tremendous amount of resources. We use something here called Mozilla Thimble that allowed kids to program their own web pages, and we created a little movie. So I'll just let this play for a minute or so, but you'll see how the 6-word memoir can be used for transfer goals. I just love this project. So amazing to see what they come up. But you can see, like, I'm confident the students, the student that did this knows what Mary Wollstonecraft was about. Right? They read Mary Wollstonecraft. They get what she was talking about, and they're able to now incorporate that in new elements and also pick images that would match with what Mary Wollstonecraft was talking about. Another transfer project, this is just a quick example. I had students, when we were talking about the Middle Ages, learned about the Middle Ages, create their own castles. They used a program called Google SketchUp. And you start basically with a 3D plane that's empty, and you build your own castle. So here's a quick look at what that looks like. And this is project problem-based learning. It's both of them. These students are going to take concepts and vocabulary words and architectural concepts and render their own original castle, and then explain why this would work as something for defense. So everything you see here, they made in this model. And yeah, there's a lot of mistakes with this project that kids can make because it's pretty complex. This is also a nice primer into architectural software and things like that, so they get used to kind of working in that element. Very cool. So that's transfer. So these are certainly bigger projects and take a lot of time. And moving forward, element number 2 is shifting your classroom paradigm by encouraging questions. This is an idea I saw in Educational Leadership magazine, so big shout out Molly Ness, who wrote this article. Was just fabulous. But it kind of solidified for me, what role questions play in the classroom. And I think it's something we all do, but do we really analyze not only whether or not we're encouraging questions from the students, but also what types of questions are we using as instructors? And obviously now we're getting into feedback, and an easy way to become a more student-centric classroom or a more student-centric teacher is to solicit feedback as frequently as possible. So Molly Ness, with a couple teachers, created, the parking lot model has always been around if you've been to workshops or things, and maybe some teachers have them. I think they're great to have in your classroom, but sometimes questions just kind of hang up there. Parking lots can kind of be known as where questions go to die, because I've seen parking lots and people don't answer all the questions on the parking lot. So in these classrooms, they created the freeway, and they would carve out class time to shift the questions from the parking lot to the freeway. And this is also a great way to embed informational text into your classes, because 99% of the time the questions are going to be answered via research using informational text. So it's a great way to bring the Common Core into your classroom if you're struggling in an area that, in a class that maybe doesn't do too much reading in it other than English class. But it's also a great way to bring informational text into higher level English classes as well, because you have to answer those questions. I mean, what Molly Ness found as she did this project was that the questions, they thought questions would get silly. Like, if we're encouraging questions this much, kids are going to ask some silly questions. And we certainly get silly questions, but they found the converse to be true, is that kids started to ask even better questions. And the freeway became the coolest place in the classroom, and kids started to enjoy answering the questions and working together to empty the parking lot and stick them on the freeway. And you can see trying to use this more and more where we are, because I just think the freeway is so cool. I'd never even heard about that. So that's all Molly Ness in her article. Love that. The easiest thing that you can do, and on a more personal level, I'll talk about this, the difference that 2 people have made in my life as an instructor, Penny Kittle and Kelly Gallagher. I just love everything that they do, is shifting your classroom paradigm. The simplest thing you can do is put yourself on equal footing with the students and do the work you're asking them to do. This has had such a profound impact on my life. I'll talk about it in a minute, but you can see some quotes here. This is Penny Kittle. I write in front of my students. And I'm just going to read a little bit because I think it's so important. I demonstrate the decisions I make to clarify and tune sentences. I model the compositions of essays, letters, and stories that matter to me, and I'm deeply invested in crafting. And she allows her students to watch her struggle. And passion is contagious. She's passionate about writing. One of the best classroom management tools is to be passionate about what you're teaching and what you're asking the students to do. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually sit down with them and model it. Kelly Gallagher has a very similar quote here. It has been my experience that my students write better when I roll up my sleeves and write alongside them. And I have found that to be incredibly true, because when I didn't do that first for many years, I mean, we're talking like a decade, I didn't write with my students or do their projects with them. And it's not always the exact same thing, but what I wanted to show my students was that I was an equal partner in the learning process. I'm asking them to take risks with their writing, to take chances with the projects that they're going to do. And if I'm not willing to do that myself, then I don't know how much street cred that gives me in that classroom. So I started to write a lot, and I put myself out there, and I blog now. But the writing took me to many great places, and I wrote for a few years for the New York Times Learning Network, and I've written for other places that I never would have thought I'd been published before. And trust me, if I can do it, everybody out there can do it. But it changed things. It changed myself, how I work with students. It made me a bit more compassionate, a bit more understanding about mistakes. It reinforced, when I was a teacher, the need to revise what you were writing, and to not put such high stakes on initial drafts of things, that writing is a process. I can't talk about writing and then ask the students and expect them to execute a introductory paragraph if they've never written it before. So that's the generative approach. They have to write those things, and then with my feedback and me working as a partner with them, I'm going to model how I'm going to revise my draft. And that changed things. The students bought into that so much. And I would share the other things I was writing about. I would share with them the rejections. I've been rejected more times than I've been accepted, but you keep moving on, and it had a big impact. And you can start that on Monday, and you're not going to be dissatisfied with the results. Trust me. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about, I have a few minutes, is student surveys. This is scary. This is a survey I gave. I was not a surveyor of students. I was petrified of doing that. My teacher has deep knowledge about the subject he teaches. That's a scary question to ask kids, isn't it? What do they think of me? And the funny thing is about student surveys, it's probably the most important thing you can do in the classroom to become really student-centric, and we don't really encourage it nationally. And I'll show you some statistics about how many states have required teachers to survey students. It's an important source of data and feedback. We know that. There's 17 that require or allow it, but I'm going to say that's just wait on that one because it's interesting. And these are sensitive instruments for gaining a richer picture of teacher effectiveness in the classroom. These are our customers. I go in as an administrator and observe you, but I might not see you for a couple weeks. I hope not, but the reality is sometimes I don't get into your classrooms, or I don't get into that specific class. If you're teaching an elective, I might not see you in that elective all year. That's the reality, especially with bigger school districts. So the people who know you best as a teacher are your students. And this is scary, but you know what? Get over it. It's going to be fine. If you get bad, negative feedback, I've gotten some bad feedback, and you refine your practice. This brings into the element of reflection, and the way you get better as an instructor is reflecting. And if we fail to reflect, we're not going to improve at all. So we can look here. So this is the sample teacher evaluation that you can get right on the web from the National Council of Teacher Quality, and 3 things here. If you ask 3 questions this week of your students, do I explain difficult things clearly? Do I make lessons interesting? And do I respect my students' ideas and suggestions? I mean, this hits on everything. My making things clear, my differentiating my instruction. I can find out in 2 minutes whether I'm doing that for my students. And I would find when I polled my students, as I'm probably talking fast now, that I moved way too quickly and I needed to slow things down. Am I making it interesting? I mean, that's huge. I mean, that's really those 2 things. Are the students learning here, number 6, and am I making it fun to be in my classroom? I mean, if there's two questions you ask, those are the two questions. And do they feel comfortable? Right? Students that are not engaged in having fun are probably not going to have success in your class. So the cool thing is, I don't know if it's cool, but 8 states require teachers to use evaluations in student surveys. Only 8. That's nationally. And I think that statistic needs to come up. And it's something that you can do very quickly. You could start this week by doing an exit ticket like this, just a 3-2-1 survey. You can start to embed these in there. Right here, I do this after I present in front of faculty or something. You know, tell me 3 things you learned today. What are you going to change about this lesson? What did I do wrong? I mean, if I asked, I would love to ask feedback now. What could I improve on? Am I not speaking clearly enough? Should I have had more examples, or did I not explain some things clearly enough? What's one question you still have? So here, you know, in a simple 3-2-1 survey at the end of a class, I can determine what they learned today. I can determine how my performance was, and I can collect data here to differentiate for future lessons. I can ask people, ask my students, what are they having trouble with? What do I need to do? Do I need to go back and reinforce things? So here's a great assessment tool, not only for me but for the students. And this is a little less combative than that simple, do I know what I'm talking about? Yes or no? Because sometimes those results can be a little scary. So let's review very quickly as we wrap up here. 1 minute. Generative learning. Take risks. It's uncomfortable. You're going to move from the front to the side of the classroom, but you're going to have better conversations and you're going to know your students better. But not every project's going to work. You're going to, the internet's going to go out and you're going to have a major problem on your hands. It's happened to me. Always have a plan B, but the key there is planning and being comfortable with taking risks in the classroom. We ask our students to embrace failure. I'm going to embrace it as an instructor as long as I'm reflective and I'm learning from those experiences. I don't have a problem. Not every project I've done has been awesome. Shift the classroom paradigm. Teacher as student. The teacher working with the students. The teacher being a part of that process with them, finding out more about their students, and using surveys. Ask your customers. They're with you every day. They're going to give you better feedback than I am. I'm only in the classroom, unfortunately, a few times, or somebody else. They see you all the time, and they're going to be honest. And they want you to be successful. They want to have fun in your class. So just ask them how to get there. So last question, when you are planning your lessons, how do you like to learn? Do you like to, it depends. But do you learn best by just kind of being told things, or do you like to tinker? Do you learn by exploring your passions and finding the answers to the questions that you might have that are always changing? So that's it. I can ask for if there's any questions or anything.
Yeah, actually, I just have one quick question for you, Jonathan, that's just taking from like a common theme that I was seeing on the Twitter feed. And that was, when you have especially inventive lessons, do you ever struggle with classroom structure?
Yeah, one of the best since I started with special little secrets that teachers know, and none of these, are original for me. I start with, I ask kids to make expectations, and I'll start it off and I'll say, I'm really nervous about X, Y, and Z. Like, what else should I be nervous about? And they'll come, they'll be brutally honest, like, oh, we're going to waste our time, and we're going to check our phones while your back's turned, and all those things. And I can write them down and say, but then, since we have those negatives, the positives follow, and they have to follow. Here's what I'm really excited about. I'm excited for me that you guys are going to create something that's never been done before in the history of school. And that's cool. And what else should I be excited for? That we're going to read more books, or we're going to find other stories that have never been taught in the classroom, and we're going to teach them to our other students. So asking them, setting some sorts of expectations and being very clear about them, especially grading criteria and those things when you get into project-based learning. But I love that, here's what I'm afraid of, but here's what I'm excited about, can kind of set expectations up nicely for those projects.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. I hope it was good, and I'm so honored to be a part of these. All these speakers are amazing, and now I know what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks is watch all these sessions. So thank you.